Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is R.L. Rousey. I am the Education Artistic Director for the Sun Valley Summer Symphony. And on behalf of all of those symphony folks, I want to welcome you all tonight and thank you for being here on this. Well, there's no sun blinding anyone in their eyes right now, so we can be grateful for that part of it. But thank you for being here tonight. Some other folks will probably come in and join us along the way. And tonight's a very special lawn chat night, but I want to tell you a couple of things just to remind you as we continue to spread the word. This season, there are two new things going on. There's a camera in the back pointed at me right now, so anytime that you want to burst into spontaneous applause, I'm probably going to get a raise. So, whenever you, thank you. But we are live streaming the chats now, and so if you on an evening have stood in line and you have one of our community seats inside of the pavilion and you'd like to stay in that seat, you can go to our website svsummersymphony.org, go to the events page, and you'll find a button to hit to live stream the event right to your device. Pop in your earbud, sit in your seat, and listen to the chat. If you're out on the lawn with folks and everybody else is enjoying dinner and you'd like to continue to enjoy dinner, you can do that and listen to the chat. If you get home after a performance and you are fascinated by the piece, you have some curiosities, maybe some questions, by noon-ish the next day, the chats go up on the website and they remain there so that you can go back and sort of review the season, listen to things that maybe you're curious about along the way. That's a brand new thing this season, so spread the words, because I know that sometimes this timing isn't exactly right for some of our patrons, but they're still curious about the information, so know that you have that resource available to you. Tonight is a very special lawn chat, and it's the first chat this season that Samir has not been with us, and it's because he's conducting the opening piece tonight. And so, as talented and wonderful as he is, we thought we shouldn't ask him to be here and then just minutes later raise the baton. So instead, we asked one of our musicians if he would do the same thing. And this is Peter Henderson, who is that guy that you see back there at the piano often. This is the guy. This is Peter Henderson, and I'll let him tell you everything about himself. And this evening, Peter, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, RL. So yes, in addition to being the guy at the piano, it is an honor to fill in for Samir this evening in the lawn chat. Tonight's program is a very vivid one, and it features a lot of new music, but we begin with a highly energetic overture by Beethoven. I'd like to start by treating that just for a bit. Beethoven, as we know, was a revolutionary figure in music history. He was kind of unique for his time because, unlike musicians even a generation earlier, for example Mozart, he really thought of himself as an artist, and he thought that, in a sense, being such an artist elevated him to the state of a kind of nobility. Indeed, there are instances in which Beethoven was dining with noble people in Vienna, and he insisted on being seated next to the master, not at the servants' table. Mozart, Haydn, previous generations, they thought of themselves, yes, as highly skilled craftspeople, but this idea of an artist who might make a career purely on the basis of imagination and talent. This is something that's kind of new in the musical world with Beethoven. This overture that we'll hear at the beginning of this concert is representative of a rather difficult process in his creative life. Beethoven was really a composer who was at home at the piano. He was truly one of the most gifted pianists of all time. When he burst onto the scene in Vienna in the 1790s, he was known not only as one of the greatest pianists, but possibly the greatest improviser of his age. And honestly, as a pianist, I would love to be able to go back in time and hear Beethoven improvise, because his imagination in full flight must have been something to behold. At any rate, as you all very likely know, he suffered a blow to his career hopes. Before he turned around 30 years old, he already began to develop signs of deafness. And for a composer, of course, this is a terrible, terrible thing. In the end, because he had such an incredible inner ear, and because his imagination and his genius were so fulsome, Beethoven was able to compose ever bolder music after he went deaf, but it did actually curtail his performing career, because, of course, being able to interact with other musicians on stage does require some oral interaction. So, in a way, Beethoven's deafness enabled the world to experience his creative personality as a composer, perhaps to an even stronger extent. Well, at any rate, Beethoven, as I said, was at home in piano music. He's one of the great symphonists, one of the greatest composers of string quartets. So, truly, I think instrumental music was where Beethoven was most himself. You have a question?
Did he write some of his best pieces after he was dead or before?
Well, the question about what is the greatest work of art is always somewhat subjective, but I think critical consensus is that Beethoven continued to develop and that some of his most sophisticated music was created at near the end of his life. For example, the very late string quartets, the Ninth Symphony, he was essentially totally deaf at the time he composed those, so yeah. Yeah. So at any rate, Beethoven, as I said, an expert in instrumental music. He is considered by many critics to have been not as successful in the realm of vocal music. And he ended up composing only one opera, and that is the work, the overture of which you will hear this evening, Fidelio. Now, the story is about a woman named Leonora who's married to a man who is a political prisoner in Spain. And she dresses up as a man and calls herself Fidelio and eventually finagles her way to getting him out of prison. And there's a dramatic moment in the play where a trumpet sounds twice and then he's able to escape from prison and they're reunited. Beethoven's really inspired by this story, and he really wanted to keep that title Leonora after the name of the heroic wife who saved her husband. However, the masters of the theater who determined what the final title would be decided they preferred the title Fidelio since it didn't conflict with other pre-existing works. Now, Beethoven had a really hard time getting this thing together. He had a libretto for a long time, but he just wasn't at home in this genre. So there were many different versions of this work, including just the overture. Now, you all know that the overture is sort of like a curtain raiser. It's a way of catching the audience's attention, a way of getting the concert underway. It's not meant to be a major work of art. But the first two Leonora overtures, which are numbered 2 and 3, it's a quirk of history, that he composed are actually really tone poems, which in a very full way describe the arc of the plot and the theme of the entire opera. And indeed, they're set in C major, which is the final goal key of the very end of the opera. But C major doesn't juxtapose well with the key of A, in which the opera actually begins. So Beethoven finally was prevailed upon. This is the 4th version he wrote, to write this shorter, more compact overture, the Fidelio overture. It's also quite a bit lighter, and it works much better in the theatrical context. So generally when people perform the entire opera, they play this Fidelio overture in E major, leads directly into the first scene, and it doesn't dominate it, as some observers have said about the Leonora overture number 3. This piece, to me, represents Beethoven in his most bipolar form, because we have right at the outset this very bold, almost martial, rising figure. It sounds like a bit of a fanfare as well, and that's juxtaposed against a solemn, contemplative chorale in 2 voices, first given in the horns. So listen to these 2 ideas right back to back. So this idea of making music have a very definitive character and then immediately replacing it with music of a very different character with no transition in between, I think that's a very Beethovenian idea. And in fact, you could say that this overture is very much dominated by these 2 ideas. When it comes time, the music eventually flows into a normal allegro. What we hear is an idea first in the horn that actually combines these 2 motives. So the horn begins with an idea of a fanfare and then immediately becomes more vocal. It's a spinning melody. It's slightly different than the one you just heard that I refer to as a chorale, but it is nevertheless vocal in its utterance. And I think of that not only as a somewhat classical idea, because Mozart will do something of the same thing, but also very Beethovenian, because you have the combination of these opposites. Did you hear that contrast between those two ideas? What's interesting to me, Beethoven studied with Haydn a bit when he was young. And as was the case with most of his instructors, he disavowed their influence. So I think he must have respected Haydn to some extent. But if you know the corpus of Haydn's symphonies, by the end of his compositional career, he was writing symphonies which very often began in the allegro quite quietly. They'd present their material. And then after 16 bars or so, the orchestra will come in a very full forte. And that's exactly what Beethoven does here. So it might betray the influence of the older master, even though Beethoven may deny it. At any rate, I hope you enjoy hearing this wonderful piece, and it'll be Samir Patel's debut conducting the Sun Valley Summer Symphony this evening. So it'll be wonderful. A question?
Can you tell us about yourself?
Oh, about myself. That's rather uninteresting. Well, I'm married to this lovely woman, Kristen Alstrom, back there. I am a music professor at Maryville University in St. Louis. I also play keyboard instruments frequently with the St. Louis Symphony, and I'm very fortunate to be the principal keyboardist here in the Sun Valley Summer Symphony as well. Other question? Yes, the Egmont Overture, I believe it was to a play, so that's classified as incidental music. Yeah, it's a different work for a different setting. But yes, he did compose that. Quite a dramatic piece.
Did he write the fifth before he went down?
The Fifth Symphony, I believe, was composed around 1804 to 1806. I didn't study up on that, but the Fifth Symphony, therefore, was composed after the deafness had already been well underway. In fact, it was underway before he finished the Eroica Symphony. The Heiligenstadt Testament, that famous letter he wrote to his brother, confessing his deafness and his emotional difficulties stemming from that, that was in 1802.
What is his best work?
Beethoven's best work. Wow. What is the greatest painting by Jackson Pollock? Yeah, I mean, for music lovers or people who have studied music their whole lives, I think these kinds of questions get more and more difficult. If you ask a child, what's your favorite color? They might blurt out, well, red. But as one accrues experience in life, then it becomes more difficult to answer these kinds of questions. It's not something I could even say. I have great affection for so many of his works. Well, Beethoven's probably most famous for that Fifth Symphony you cited. The motivic concentration and compression of the first movement is extreme and highly unusual, and that made it a very iconic work. Obviously, the Ninth Symphony has become sort of an emblem of humanism over the centuries. Highly influential work, the first work in the symphonic form to really represent the chorus in that way. He's probably most famous for those two pieces, but there are also piano pieces like the Moonlight Sonata, first movement, very frequently played. Oh my, we're running short on time, are we?
What is your favorite Beethoven piano concerto?
Oh, of the piano concerti. Well, you're asking me personally. My favorite of them is the fourth, in G major. Yeah. That. Well, the fifth is a glorious and very grand work. Obviously, an incredible masterpiece, and the slow movement has an incredible atmosphere that balances the grandeur of the outer movements very well. But the fourth concerto just has an amazing natural quality to its forms, and the piano writing is so inventive, and the novelty of the middle movement. But it's quite profound. I think for me, it's my favorite. But so. We should probably, I don't know if Alex or Fally, the composer, was going to join me here. There he is. Well, all right, so briefly, we will hear a work by Anthony Di Lorenzo. It is a horn concerto for the great Bill Vermeulen, truly one of the great horn players in America today. And we're very fortunate he's the principal horn of the Sun Valley Summer Symphony. Bill is going to be giving a performance of a piece that started its life as a sonata, but Anthony Di Lorenzo, as you will hear, he is influenced by film music. Indeed, John Williams is one of his musical mentors. And what I hear very much in the piece is that grand era from the 1930s, when you have Korngold and Steiner writing these epic romantic scores for these big studio films. I think that kind of musical language, that opulence and romanticism, is what you'll hear in this concerto. It's a rather small-scaled work, but nevertheless very tuneful, very joyful, and I know you'll enjoy hearing it. But please let me welcome now Alex Orfali to discuss his work, which will end the program after intermission. Alex, welcome.
Actually, I'll answer the question about the Beethoven Symphony just because I heard it, and I think a lot of us have probably the same interactions. For me, as much as I love any of Beethoven, Beethoven's Third is my favorite, only because that's the first one I ever really played and studied, and because of that, I have a great affinity for that piece. But again, that's just because that's the first one I really, as a high school student, got to dig into. So it has a special meaning to me. The Ninth is always going to be a great piece. The Fifth is a fantastic piece. But there's something very revolutionary about the Third that still sticks with me to this day. And it's so impossible to answer those questions.
So Alex, I'm sure the audience here knows you as a performer. You've performed as a timpanist with many orchestras, and obviously as the principal timpanist of the Sun Valley Summer Symphony. Now, when did you start composing? What was the idea behind this creative spark in you?
Yeah, I started composing a long time ago, but getting into the orchestra world has been more recent. A lot of my music originally was percussion-only music, and a lot of people start out that way, writing piano music or whatever is their instrument. Personally, I have started to get felt the limitations of only being able to write for percussion and wanting to be able to have more expressive qualities that are not necessarily germane to the percussion family of instruments. So that has pushed me to want to start and write for larger ensembles, orchestras, mixed ensembles, and that's sort of how I got involved in that. I never, my personal shout out to myself, I never studied composition. I went to school as a performance major, music performance major. I've played in orchestras for 20 years now, and along the way I've done some composition, which sometimes has its pitfalls because I'm always learning. That's what I love about getting to write and having an opportunity to write something for a fantastic group of soloists and such a great orchestra, because I can push limits of things that people say, no, you can't do this and you can't do that. But at the same time, when somebody comes to me and says, no, really, this isn't going to work, I need to digest that, take that in, and I learn from that. And so every time I get to write another big piece like this, I learn something new, which hopefully will continue my own education now as a composer. And that's one of the things that always keeps bringing me back to composition.
Music is a lifelong discipline, for sure. Even in performing, we continue to learn. Now, near the beginning of the piece, you use the celesta and the harps and the piano to play this motive, and you jestingly called it the light motif. That's a Wagner joke.
Yes.
So it seems like you, at the start, are setting out these long sonorities based on these light motifs. What was in your mind as you were creating this texture?
So I started this piece just about a year ago when I was out here last year, and I wrote, a good 5 minutes of music that I wound up throwing away and starting all over again. And the one thing that remained from my original impetus was this light motive. And I don't know, it just kind of came to me, and originally it was most of that was in the percussion section, and I ultimately wound up reorchestrating that and moved that to the harps and celeste, which I sort of made the harps, celeste, and piano a secondary solo section, what we would call like a concertante, or
Yeah, there's a kind of Baroque idea.
yeah, right. That there's a second solo group. It's because of some of the acoustical properties, it's not necessarily that defined, but that is the idea, that it is this second solo group, and the percussion section actually only winds up doing that idea once on their own, and it always remains in the harps and pianos, and the keyboards. And I don't know if it's just that's one of the original ideas that came to me for this piece, and the piece just sort of grew out of that. And I wound up taking the notes, the sonorities from that, and coming up with this big string chord to follow around it, and that's sort of how that came to life.
So the piece is somewhat framed by this leitmotif in a sense that sonority comes back several times in the work, and that's kind of a narrative idea within it. In later sections, we hear references to other music. I hear a little minimalism, maybe a nod to John Adams at the end of the part one, and Steve Reich, as you mentioned. And then there's an interesting portion during the second section when you seem to quote plain chant. You even have the orchestra kind of singing a chant-like melody. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So that's in the third section. The orchestra will sing, and that was one of the original concepts I had for this piece. Was that the marimba, which is at the front of the stage, 3 of the players are at the marimba, and that this marimba sonority would fade in and out, and the orchestra would be singing behind it. I just, as a concept, thought that this was a very cool idea and something I hadn't ever heard. And, composers are always, it's hard. Everybody's written everything. Almost every idea or concept somebody's come up with. So you're always trying to come up with your own original thing, hopefully. And that was the one little thing I had that I was like, I'm pretty sure I've never heard this before. So I wanted to do it. And then because of that idea, I wound up going back to the first part and putting that same plain chant idea in the first part of the piece, in the brass section, to help tie the piece together. And it's funny how these creative things sort of come together. They don't always come linearly. Sometimes you work backwards and forwards simultaneously.
Well, sadly, we're running short on time. Does anyone in the audience here have any questions for Alex that you'd like to ask him about his piece?
I'd like to hear a little bit about Alex's background.
We'd like to hear about Alex's background.
Musical background, or? Yeah, so I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. A long time ago, went to school in Cleveland, Ohio. I was a member of the New World Symphony, which is America's training orchestra in Miami. I used to live in Spain. I played in an orchestra in Spain for a while. Then I moved out to the Bay Area where I currently live. I have performed regularly with the San Francisco Symphony, and now I work as a freelance musician in the Bay Area, playing in the California Symphony among a myriad of other groups.
Any other questions? Well, I hope you enjoy this wonderful concert featuring music by composers connected to this Sun Valley Summer Symphony, as well as Beethoven, and a world premiere of a fabulous new work by Alex Orfali.
Enjoy, everybody.